It's 4 o'clock on Wednesday, and you know what that means, don't you? It's time for another exciting episode of Taxi's Quarantini Happy Hour. Woohoo! This week, or today, starring special guest, Mr. Ronan Chris Murphy. Yeah, baby. Woo! And thank you, fake audience. Thank you, fake band. Let's see if anybody has arrived in the chat room yet. All right, you guys got me there? Hello, Akira. Hello, Dan Weber. Oh, I'm very blurry. Whoa. Man, oh man. Focus camera. Okay, there we go. Hey, Pat Wara, how are you? Good to see you in there. Paul House, wow, staying up late tonight. So, for those of you who are early arrivals, or I should say on-time arrivals, we changed it. We changed the daily Quarantini Happy Hour to 4 o'clock because several people in the U.S. were saying, I can't watch it, I'm working from home, which all of us at Taxi are. And, wow, Paul starting at midnight. Well, you're going to bed at 1:02 a.m. right after the show's over. Hello, Darren Moss in Australia. How are you? Anyway, sorry. I just choked down half of a throat lozenge and some tea and was making some matzo ball soup in preparation for my solo Seder tonight. It is Passover. In about 8 minutes, we're going to be joined by Ronan Chris Murphy, who is an engineer, producer. He's been on the show many times. He's been a mentor at the Road Rally, a class presenter at the Road Rally, a longtime friend of mine, and just one of the greatest guys. So we're going to spend a little time. Pat Wara, thank you for saying Happy Passover. Appreciate that. Hello, Martin Gravel. Hello, Edmund Red. Edmund Red says that he loves compression like chocolate. He does. So I want to answer a couple questions before we call him. And these were things that were in the chat of the show yesterday, and I didn't get to answer them. And after we're done with Ronan, I will go back and answer more of the questions. Dan Weber wants to know, what's it like to mix on a real SSL as opposed to a fake one, a knockoff made in China? I'm assuming you mean instead of using like SSL plugins or maybe so, like the SSL6 or one of the little minis or just a channel strip or something. So prior to me, I grew up I didn't grow up, but I started my career at Criteria Studios in Miami, which was a very famous, very big-time studio back in the day. And they had 3 consoles made by a company called MCI. And they were nearly custom consoles that were made by a gentleman named G. Parned. And he got the job of servicing a couple of 2-track machines for the owner of Criteria, whose name was Mac Emmerman, and in the process came up with better sounding 2-track tape machines and then decided to get into building consoles. Well, because guys like Tom Dowd, who I was very fortunate to work with extensively at Criteria, and Arif Marden and Jerry Wexler, so the whole Atlantic Records crew regularly came to Miami for the winters and worked out of Criteria. And so when G. Parned built these MCI semi-custom consoles, the exact same console would go to Criteria and to Atlantic Studios in New York so that they could bounce back and forth between rooms and feel comfortable in those consoles. Well, eventually, or somewhere around, I would say 1976-ish, MCI built its first inline recording console, and all of us on the staff were very involved in the topography and the nomenclature, all the good stuff. It's just the overall design of that console. They would come like once a week for a meeting and show us new channel strips and new blueprints. Sorry. So I worked a lot on MCI consoles. Now, they were very functional consoles. They were solid consoles. They were pretty reliable consoles. I hate to speak ill of them because G. Parnett was a wonderful man, and I had many friends that worked at the company. They didn't sound great. They sounded okay. The MCI 24-track tape machine sounded really good, but you had to work super duper hard to get a really good sound out of an MCI console. The other major players at the time were API, Harrison consoles, and believe it or not, there were very few Neve consoles in America at that time. So then around, I think it was 82-ish, I moved to New York and continued working on MCI consoles there. And then, lo and behold, I ended up becoming the studio manager at a facility called Howard Schwartz Recording, which was the preeminent audio post-production facility for a lot of sports television, a lot of long-form TV, and TV commercials, just like crazy amounts of big TV commercials. And as studio manager, I went to the owner and said, Howie, we need an SSL. And lo and behold, he let me get one. It was only $660,000. And I remember him saying to me the day that we first turned it on, he looked at me, put his hand on my shoulder and said, this thing better pay for itself or you're in deep doo-doo. It sounded great. It was so easy to operate. I don't think I ever opened the manual for the SSL. Everything was kind of self-explanatory. I think that I asked, like Bob Clearmountain was in the room next to mine one time after we got our second SSL, and he and I hung out a little bit, and he showed me some tricks, things that I hadn't even thought of doing. So, but as far as learning the basics and how did it sound, it was just great. It was awesome. I will say that I think Neve consoles have more of a sound to them. They just sound rich. I mean, the SSLs sound great, don't get me wrong, but the Neves have a kind of identifiable sound. I can practically listen to something on the radio or listen to a record and go, okay, that was recorded on a Neve. Nowadays, it'd be tough because there's so many Neve, standalone outboard channel strips and blah, blah, blah. But, there was a period before all the channel strips became available that I could actually hear if something was done on a Neve. But the SSL was just a dream. It hardly ever broke. The switches were reliable, which, it doesn't sound like a big thing, but it is a big thing. Hardly ever had to pop a channel strip out. And any engineer will tell you that's worked, ridiculous hours on big projects, that the maintenance guys are there most of the time, and most of the time till late at night. But not uncommon that an engineer would have to pop a drawer open on a multitrack and pull out a playback card or a record card and swap it out with another one and retweak, the input levels and the output levels. Same thing is true for consoles. So I got pretty familiar with SSL. Not that I had to change them out often, but we were always delighted that they did what we called seating well, meaning that they slid the connectors on the edge of the PC boards, which were obviously underneath the channel strips. There were some consoles that when you tried to replace them, you couldn't get them in there, and you had to really wiggle them and jam them in there. And a lot of times, excuse me, you would strip the metal, what they called lands, the connectors, and mess up a whole channel strip. Sorry. I've had a sore throat, not that kind of sore throat, all day today. Has anybody heard Clear Mountain's podcast? No, but I bet it sounds really good. Oh, man. Andre Stepanian wants to know, hi, Michael, are you using a webcam? The picture is so clear. I am. I'm using a Logitech Brio. Logitech C922 looks identical. I bought the Brio because it's a 4K camera, but we're not broadcasting in 4K, so it doesn't really matter. I just felt like spending money on a new camera, so I got a new camera. Okay, love you, Ronan. Well, he's not here yet. Tell him when he gets here. But you know what? It's time to call him. Let me break out the phone. Hopefully he does a lot of talking today because my voice is a little less than optimal. But I've been checking my temperature about every 3 hours now for 3 weeks, and I'm good. No other symptoms. There's his number.
Hello.
Hey, Ronan, it's Michael. How are you?
I'm good. I've been lurking online for the last 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. So was I telling the truth about Neves and SSLs?
I would say yes.
Okay, good.
But, it's mixing on an SSL is just a joy. Maybe I'm romanticizing it, but, if I'm a good person and I, get to heaven, I'll show up and they'll just put my butt in front of a G-Series SSL and have me just start mixing great records.
Absolutely.
It's once you kind of get the lay of the land, it's really fast to work.
Yeah.
And, what I love, one of the nice things about, working on consoles and stuff is, it starts to feel more like playing an instrument where you can just go, oh yeah, this kick drum needs a little more top or a little less top. And when you work on one kind of console for a long time, you know that you don't even really think about numbers. You start to think about, oh yeah, the snare drum needs this EQ band at 10 o'clock. And you just start sort of thinking of it like playing an instrument. So that's one of the things, when you have kind of more digital workflow, which has its own advantages, that whole kind of direct connection of being able to work like you're playing an instrument, that diminishes a little bit. But it's and the great thing about SSLs too is they've got really good dynamics and really good EQs, and Andy Wallace, who I think is one of the best rock mixers of the last couple decades. His work was mostly just the SSL. He used very little outboard.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Pretty darn good records.
Yeah, I've got to say, I had the room that my SSL went into in New York. I had 4 Pultecs, original real Pultecs. Mm-hmm. I think 3 LA4s. Which ones were the tubes? LA4s or LA3As?
Twos.
LA2s. Okay, so I had three of those original real ones.
Yep.
Pair of 1176s, just about every piece of outboard you could possibly want, including Phil Spector's 2 EMT plates in that room.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I bought them from Phil Ramone when he shut down his studio, and he got them from Phil Spector. So I had, the room of joy. And I've got to say, I would say 80% of the compression that I used on records or on any kind of session were, in fact, the SSL compressors. I think they sounded great.
Absolutely.
Loved the EQ, loved the preamps. I loved everything about that console. The only thing was that there were times I wished I had a Neve for certain types of vocalists. You could always get a great vocal sound on an SSL, but Neves had that extra 5%, harmonic distortion that just works so well on some things.
Well, to me, the kind of dream scenario was always getting to track with something, like a Neve or an API or something with a little bit more character, and then mix it on SSL. Because, SSL didn't, unless you start really cranking the EQs, they don't impart a lot of their own taste, except for, of course, the bus compression. But that's kind of always the best scenario. So even when I was working lots on SSLs for mixing or those sessions, I usually had a few kind of favorite outboard mic pre's or compressors that I'd track through on the way in, and then SSL is just so great at sort of sorting things out and putting things in their place.
Yeah, that's my father-in-law on the answering machine.
Wishing you a happy Passover.
Yeah, exactly. I hope he doesn't say anything really personal. That would be embarrassing. I got to say, Off subject for a second. I love my father-in-law. He's in his 70s. He's a private pilot. He owns his own Cessna. His engine conked out on his Cessna about a year and a half ago. They were at our house. They were at our house for Thanksgiving, and he said, "Yeah, the Cessna's in the shop." I said, "For what?" He said, "New engine." I said, "Why? Did you have too many hours on the old one?" He goes, "No, actually, it was in great shape, but it crapped out on me at like 5,000 feet." So I had to glide it into an airport. And I said, "Holy crap, I can't believe you didn't tell us." So he goes, "No big deal. No big deal. I had a choice of 2 airports." I mean, how many people do you know that are, a mile high in an airplane, have the engine conk out? Don't even mention it to anybody. Anyway,
wow.
I digress. But yes, I agree with everything that you said. Yeah, in a perfect world, like recording something in a great live room like Studio A at the power station on a classic Neve, and then mixing on an SSL would be the dream scenario. Absolutely.
But people really need to remember that, when old timers like us start, waxing poetic and romantic about stuff, is there's insanely great records that were made completely opposite to the way we're talking about. Less than ideal circumstances, and Deep Purple recorded Machine Head kind of in the lobby of a in the lobby of a hotel.
Yeah.
No, actually a hallway of a hotel, not the lobby, but in hallway of a hotel.
Yeah, if the folks watching have never looked at the back of the album cover on Machine Head, you can see all that stuff. They were supposed to go to a studio in France or Switzerland, and when they arrived, the place was burning down.
Smoke on the water.
Yeah, and that's exactly where Smoke on the Water came from. So they just got a bunch of gear and threw it into another hotel or a house or something, and that's where they recorded.
In a hotel, and they literally had it jury-rigged. They brought a remote truck outside, and they literally had to do something like go into one of the guest rooms and climb out a window to go and listen to playback in the truck. So, it's one of those things where, again, those of us who've had a chance to work in amazing multi-million-dollar studios and things like that, there's something super, super beautiful about that. But also, just being able to make records at all or make recordings at all. Some of the most beautiful records ever made were made by people in their living room, bedroom, and hello Billie Eilish.
Yeah.
Miss every Grammy ever given out for the record that they didn't mix it there, but they tracked that whole record in a bedroom with really, really minimal gear.
Absolutely.
Yes.
As you and I have both agreed on before, it's a lot more about the performance than it is the gear.
And that's even one of those things, like when I used to, I still do them a little less often now, but when I do like my 6-day recording boot camps, a lot of times a lot of hardware stuff was in my workflow, and I demonstrate these techniques and stuff and kind of say, hey, look at this technique and blah blah blah, and wow people. And then at the end of the course, they'd be like, wow, I love the guitar sound you got or something. I really got to buy that piece of hardware you used. And I thought, oh my God, I completely failed this person. I should give them their money back if that's the takeaway they got from this. Because reality is so much of it is, just the craft and what goes in front of the microphone and things like that. Because, you've got a guitar that sounds cool and, mics that don't suck.
Yeah.
Even just with a mid-range, interface, you're not at elite level, but there's no real reason you can't be up and running with the big dogs with that stuff if you make kind of cool creative decisions.
Around 1995 or 96, there was a taxi band called Martin's Dam from Philadelphia, and they really knew what they were doing. They were a signed act under another name, Bricklin, a couple of years prior to that. Anyway, we kind of all fell in love with each other. They invited me to come out and do some sessions with them at their parents' house in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. Uh-huh. And I set up a Mackie 8 bus in their parents' garage. I don't think I had any outboard gear at all, come to think of it. We had a bunch of 57s, a couple of 421s, and I think we rented one Neumann U87. And we set them up in the parents' living room. They had a wood floor, a stone fireplace, a wood beam ceiling, and a long glass wall on one side, and a few throw rugs. And honestly, if I played it for you, you would never know that that wasn't done in a world-class studio. So
Yeah.
they were so good. And, I had years of studio chops that I could apply to minimal gear, and it worked and it sounded, honestly, it's one of the best recordings I ever did, but I think it had more to do with their touch of the instruments than anything.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, actually, the first major label thing I ever worked on. It was a 4-bus little analog Mackie and a couple ADAT machines and a few pieces of outboard set up in my living room.
Yeah.
And, so I was actually talking with a consulting client in the UK this morning, and one of the things, he was basically trying to figure out about getting up to the next level in mixing. There's certainly some technical things that he was missing the mark on, not in a big way, but in terms of dealing with low bids and things like that. But a big part of what was, I think, holding him back in terms of getting up to the next level is he tended to be kind of fairly timid with stuff. Everything was sort of like, okay, not push very hard, get everything kind of politely in its place. And I shared with him one of the revelations that I had as a mixer is, there's not many things in the world I'm really good at, but I'm pretty good at mixing. I know what I'm doing, and
I've heard.
But I remember kind of working on these records, and I'd mix these albums where I'm like, this is just technically some of the best work I've ever done. There's 3-dimensionality, and there's this and that, and back depth, and all of this, and I'm just thinking how brilliant I am, and then some young guy or gal will, come up with this, mix that just sort of kicks my butt, like in the marketplace, or, oh wow, a client I was after went with this less experienced person, and I'm like, wait a second, what about there's this thing going on with their hi-hats messed up, and then I realized what they were doing was just cooler than what I was doing. Yeah. I was doing things that would really impress my other engineer friends,
right?
But I was doing that at the mistake of making things really cool. So, that less experienced person would push something over the top, or, oh yeah, they really drove bass synths really hard, or there's some aspect of it that was exciting and compelling. And I was, like me with all my expertise on this, was getting my butt kicked by people with way less experience because they were doing the right thing. They were trying to make cool records that connected with people, and I was trying to make cool records that would impress my engineer friends. And so
when
I hope I learned my lesson.
When you're working in a home studio, and you've got the freedom of ignorance,
Yes,
there's something to be said for that. I mean, you'll experiment, you'll make a lot of mistakes, but sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you just have the right perspective on things,
and that's how you can basically, somebody with less experience can kick the butt of people with more experience, because in the reality is, if you come up with something new, a new way of looking at things, a new way of arranging or something like that, you've written the rules. And so if you do your own thing, me with hundreds of albums under my belt, I can't compete with that. You've kicked my butt because you've created something that's new. You have set the standards, and I could try and chase what you did. But that's one of the things too, is especially with this world where there's a zillion, in the time we have this conversation, Lord knows how many records are going to come out on Spotify and SoundCloud and all those kinds of things. And I think people have a better chance of connecting with people or standing out of the pack if they try to do something unique where people hear it and it's something fresh. Because the reality is, if you try and make recordings that are just, the more traditional you try and make your recording in a lot of ways, the less you will succeed at it, because you probably, if you don't have the kind of experience people at my level have, you probably won't be able to make traditional sounding records at the level I make. But if you do something unique and creative that has its own voice, again, you've just, kicked my butt all over the court.
The trick is knowing the fine line between finding that own experimental, groundbreaking voice and doing stuff that's so far out there that it's unappealing to anybody. And there's an art to finding your voice, creating something new, and just not going crazy for this. I'm going to change. Only once every few generations do we get a Beatles. And,
yes.
there are a lot of people that fool themselves or fancy themselves as groundbreaking as the Beatles, and really all they're being is foolish. But having some basic knowledge about the physics of sound and where the electrons go, and then setting yourself free, pretty good formula.
Yeah, one of the challenges, though, too, is that a lot of people, and you run into this when you're producing and stuff, too. People sort of think, hey, I'm doing this really new thing, and you're like, it's not really working. And it's like, yeah, but it's new, and they're thinking it's new because they haven't heard it on records or on the radio or something like that. Right. And sometimes it is the case where actually you're doing that thing that lots of people have done that keeps them off the radio, that keeps them from getting their music placed in a film, and things like that. So that's always the challenge, but. But the more people kind of carve their own voice, the better chance they have to, make their own statement.
So while we're on the subject of home recording, and while we're in the middle of the quarantine, and God only knows how much longer we're going to be quarantined, but people are obviously doing more recording because they're stuck at home and they've got the luxury of time. Even if they're working from home, still, you don't have 2 hours of your day sucked by a commute. So you got more time right there. So given that home recording scenario, are there any tips that you have for people who are working out of their home studios? What can they do to be more productive in their home studios while they've got this luxury of time?
Well, I think a big part of it is to, in some ways, sort of simplify the technical side of what you're doing so you can stay more focused on the craft side of what you're doing. It's so easy to sort of get sucked into kind of minutia, especially when we have a zillion different plugins we can play with and a zillion different things we can do. Is really kind of focusing on kind of keeping a simple path, like, hey, I'm going to record a guitar, and looking at, okay, find a decent mic, put it in front of it, keep your levels conservative, make sure you play great, move on to the next thing. So a lot of times people might get tied up in, trying to do lots of sort of fancier techniques or things like that when, and there is certainly time for that. And, if the joy of it is just experimenting with those techniques, absolutely go for that as much as you want. But in terms of actually getting stuff done, really focusing on, doing something is as straightforward as you can do it to get the point across, and then actually commit and move on to it. So going, okay, yeah, that was the guitar part. And especially too, where we have a zillion different virtual instruments that came with our DAW, not even to mention third-party stuff, is, find a sound that kind of expresses what you want to do, commit to it, and then move on to the next thing and keep building from that. Because, unless this is all about the joy of just exploring with sounds and stuff, which is totally valid. Mm-hmm. But if the goal is to actually get stuff out in the world that you can, share with your friends or try and pitch to TV or pitch to labels or whatever your end goal is, the super important thing is to try and not get bogged down in endless options, endless revisions and things like that, but actually commit stuff and move on.
I used to do that when I had days off. Like if I had a week off between two records, I would still go into the studio. And those were the days where my assistants and I would just experiment with things, all those things that we wished we had the time to do working on a record. But, when people are paying a couple $100 an hour for a world-class studio, they don't want you to learn on their dime. And that's certainly understandable. A certain amount of experimentation is great. But they get pissy if they feel like, come on, do you really need to spend 4 hours trying different mics on the snare? Not really. But after the album's done and the drum set hasn't been picked up by cartage, Go in the studio the next day as tired as you are and as much as you don't want to see that room, and try every mic in the place on that snare. Then you've got it in your arsenal of tricks for the next record.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the same as sort of like sitting and running scales on your instrument. It's super important to do it, getting to know your instrument. But, when you're in rehearsal with the band, or when you're, doing a session, that's not the time to sort of do that sort of thing. That's one of those things where you're just building up your skill set, your arsenal, your expertise, so that when you go in. So yeah, I think it's a really good idea to separate those into times, and I do the same thing too. A lot of times too is I've got things in my own areas lacking expertise that I'm trying to bump up, and a lot of times, even if I'm mixing a record for somebody, I'll fire up the studio 45 minutes early and study and train and practice. So like, oh yeah, there's I'll keep an eye on what kind of new things are happening in terms of programming beats and things like that, going, okay, that's not my area of expertise. Let me just spend 45 minutes a couple times a week going and studying what the great artists are doing, and go, okay, how did they program that kind of thing? What kind of sounds are they working with?
Right.
How can I build that up? Because yeah, when it comes time to actually make art or make product or whatever your end goal is, you want to just be really making it, and trying not to be running your scales when it's time to be actually writing your music.
So you just mentioned programming drums, and that's not an area maybe of your greatest expertise. But do you have any tips? Yesterday, I think somebody asked in the comments after the show, how do you, if you're not going to use loops because they sound too obvious and too boring, and just all that bad stuff that loops can do, how do you make great sounding drums at home? And I was going to respond to them, and I thought I'd save it for the show, but I'm a big fan of Easy Drummer and Superior Drummer, and there's several other comparable programs out there. How would you go about taking those great sounding drums and all the utility that's built into that software, and then make it sound a little more human?
Great question. Well, there's a couple things, and this is something that I used to say a lot at the road rally, getting to hear people's stuff, and I've said this before, but it's just kind of insane every year how much the entire herd is just getting better and better and better.
Right.
But one of the things that I would constantly hear is somebody would play me, hey, here's a something I did for a traditional country listing, and like, okay, great, and the kick drum is doing these like 16th note triplet things, and because they got really excited about what they could do with the programming, or they went through like MIDI banks and found something that sounded fancy. And anybody who's ever done any work in Nashville knows that the guy who shows up and does those kind of drum parts doesn't show up at the next sessions. So in so many genres of music, the part that a real human that would get the gig would play is super, super simple. And that's really important to stay focused on. And it's also really important to remember that as I say this, I spent yesterday working on drum parts from Terry Bozzio. So I have no problem with fancy stuff. But there's a time for that. So one of the things you can do is actually just something like Easy Drummer, where you can pull in these existing MIDI parts, and they're pretty darn good. One thing is you can do kind of small changes, not really fancy things, but throw in like a little and of on a kick drum part at the turnaround, and keep them simple. But then one of my favorite tricks is to add real percussion on top of it. And even better yet, if you do have a drum set or something like real hi-hats, because it's amazing how much putting one real element into a programmed drum part can make it feel kind of very organic and real, especially with things like modern country, which is, they'll have a guy come in, play the drums, and then they'll quantize his part, and then they'll replace him with samples, and okay, the cymbals remain. So with so much of that's where a lot of modern stuff is, if you start fake and add a little bit of real, in some ways you kind of end up at the same same spot. So yeah, my favorite things to do that is, keep things simple unless the goal is to be fancy, which again, sometimes that is, but most kind of things, keep it pretty simple and then try and sneak in some sort of organic elements. And you'll be amazed how much you can fool people.
I've become pretty friendly with Ken Calais, who engineered and produced Rumors and Tusk. And reading both of those books, by the way, which if you guys haven't read them yet, by Making Rumors and Getting Tusked, they're both great books. They did so much replacement stuff, but it was like real drums laid down and then replaced it with other drums. But it's amazing, and I always wondered on Rumors if they overdubbed the cymbals later, but they didn't. They actually played the cymbals with the real band, with the live band in the room, and that was one of the few things they actually kept. But I love the sound of the cymbals on that record.
And I won't say who it is, but there's a super, super famous band that a buddy of mine worked on as an engineer who did a very big live album. And we were talking about it. He said, yeah, I think the kick drum was used to trigger a sample, but aside from that, there's not really anything else live really on that record.
Well,
and not to say that that's positive or negative, but it should be encouraging for people who don't have the option of, having a great drummer on call or being a great drummer and having a great drum room, is the fact that we are in such a hybridized era of music.
Yeah.
That really has put a lot of advantages to to sort of the home studio or the smaller studio or even the folks who have less experience. It's very easy to sort of get up into being somewhat of a contender, whereas before it might have taken a much longer time to get there. So that should hopefully be kind of exciting to folks working on their own.
Somebody asked in the comments yesterday or the day before, how do you get great sounding hand claps? So tell them what you would do besides using like 808 claps or something. How do you, if you're recording real hand claps, what would your methodology be?
To get as many people doing it as possible. Well, not 50, but there's a very different thing of, if you could get 4 people around an omnidirectional mic, because what's kind of cool is the tight performance, but a little bit of natural flamming. And what I like to do is if I'm trying to do kind of hand claps on a record, we'll kind of get whoever can actually kind of clap in time and get them around an omnidirectional mic if possible. And then I like to kind of do maybe like 3 passes of that.
Yep. And
pan them out left, center, right. And that kind of gives you a great sound. Technically, hand claps aren't tough to do, but there is a different thing about 4 people triple tracking versus 1 person just doing it 12 times. But if you are going to kind of do it 12 times yourself, because again, you're quarantined and you can't invite your neighbors over to hand clap, the thing that makes something like hand claps, and the same is for string parts or choirs and things like that makes them interesting and fuller and richer, is the diversity.
Right.
So when you clap, move slight, change your distance from the microphone, smack your hands together with them very flat, and then another time with them a little bit cupped, and maybe even change some microphones. So you start to get that diversity, because that's a super important takeaway for hand claps or anything, is that more of the same thing generally doesn't make things bigger or fuller in terms of sonics or frequencies. It's that diversity that gives something, that's kind of a rich sound. It's everybody clapping, but everyone's hands are different sizes and different distances from the microphone and things like that gives it that, here's a group of people clapping kind of thing. So when you're doing hand claps, and the same thing would be if you were a viola player and wanted to create kind of a string ensemble sound, don't play the same way in the same register on the same mic at the same distance 8 times.
Right.
Move a different, move 3 or 4 feet back. Play next time. Play, with the bow a little closer to the bridge. Play a little harder one time, a little softer one time. And it's creating that sort of range of sonic diversity that'll make something feel more like an ensemble versus just a muddy version of the same thing.
I used to have some people, I agree with you totally about having a group of people. I agree completely about using the mic in Omni. Omni is an underappreciated pattern on microphones. Most people don't really take the time to listen to what Omni brings to a sound. Oftentimes it sounds more open and just seems to sound a little better. So rule of thumb, use Omni whenever you can. Sometimes it's not going to work because the room might be too reflective or bleed from other stuff. But when you're doing overdubs of one thing at a time, even an acoustic guitar, try, an 87 in Omni 3 feet from a guitar. And if the room is decent sounding, it's going to sound better than having it in cardioid. But I used to have people take a piece of paper like this and double it over and then use either adhesive tape or rubber bands and put a piece of paper on one hand and then have other people wear gloves so that not everybody had hands, just pure hands. Yeah. That worked really well. At one time, there was a band called the Lloyd Ellery Band. I can't believe I remember this. It was like 35, 40 years ago, doing a song called All Through the Night. And what we did was we did hand claps with 4 people, triple tracked it. Then we took a sheet of like 1/2-inch plywood, put it on concrete blocks on the floor, and had 4 people sit down with different sized drumsticks and double those with the claps.
Oh, wow.
And then the DBX 165 limiter is probably the greatest, in my opinion, for hand claps. It brings something to a hand clap that other compressors don't get. So try that. If you can get your hands on an old, it's DBX 160, actually, not a 165.
Yeah. And I know somebody, I think maybe Softtube is making a clone of that. I haven't used it, but I know that there's somebody making some software version of that. One thing I want to throw out for the people listening, I totally agree with Michael about trying to, experiment with Omni if you have the option. I tend to use cardioids a lot just because I like the focus sound that sort of fits my aesthetic, but always if you can experiment. But the things you want to be listening for are 2 things. One is if you switch from cardioid to Omni, you're going to get more room ambience, which is sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing.
Right.
But that's one of the things to listen for. But the other things you want to listen for is a lot of times, if you have the mic in a little bit closer, it will give you a broader range of the instrument. So the Omni is essentially picking up all over the place or not rejecting anything. So if you put it in front of a guitar or in front of a piano, its polar pattern is going to pick up a wider range of it. But also of all the most common polar patterns, omnidirectional is the one that doesn't have something called proximity effect. So when you have a cardioid or bidirectional microphone, as you move the microphone and the sound source closer together, you're going to get this artificial buildup of low frequencies and low mid frequencies, which is sometimes cool, sometimes not cool. But with an omnidirectional mic, you can move the mic as close or far away, and it's not going to create this artificial boost of low frequencies. So that's why a lot of times on an acoustic guitar, or you want something jangly or shimmery, it can be a great option because there is none of that low-end buildup. Also, sometimes you might notice if you record a singer really close, it just sounds boomier than natural, which sometimes is really cool, but sometimes can make things a little bit muddy. So switching from your cardioid to omnidirectional will give you more room ambience, a sort of more broader, even coverage of the instrument, and it won't give you that artificial buildup that you're going to get from a cardioid or a bidirectional mic, that artificial buildup of low frequencies if you end up getting the mic and the sound source closer together.
Not many people ever have the opportunity to overdub a French horn, but I have had that opportunity a few times. Mm-hmm. And sticking an 87 or a 414 in the corner of a room, like with like Pecky cedar, Pecky cypress, whatever it is on the wall. A room that's fairly reflective but not overly bright, super reflective. Stick the player in the corner of the room about 4 to 6 feet away from the corner, blowing the bell of the horn into the corner, and stick an 87 and Omni in that corner, and it will sound magical. So there you go.
Nice.
For all of you who have to record a French horn someday. Let's talk about something that I don't think I've ever asked you on any episode, and I'm not sure people talk about it ever. But now that people are quarantined and home alone and doing recording, you and I have discussed tricks to get a great vocal performance when we're or somebody is behind the console on the other side of the glass, and kind of coaching them through it. How can somebody doing a solo, a lead vocal, when they're all alone, how can they get the best performance out of that? Because there's nobody objective in the room.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of tricky. I mean, Prince did it. Why can't you? But
that's the funniest thing you've ever said on a show.
But one of the things is having that objective outside. One of the benefits of that is somebody, being able to point out, hey, you're going a little flat on the bridge, or hey, you could do it this way. But one of the other advantages of having that objective third person there is to go, no, dude, that was really good. Because right. it's so easy for us, in our own little world to, let the demons come out and go, oh God, I suck, I can't sing, nobody ever want to hear me do this. So one of the things I would say the best thing to do is, if you're on that fence, is just go and have fun. And I'm a big proponent of, especially of trying the option of just not using headphones. Grab a handheld Shure SM58 or 57, turn up the speakers, and just rock out. Yep. And actually have fun, dance around the room, be an idiot. The great thing about no one around is nobody's there to laugh or whatever if doing a Rolling Stones chicken dance across the floor is what gets you excited and gets a great performance. So the big thing is to just kind of go and have fun. And I think cranking up the speakers, handheld, really having fun with it. And the cool thing is, you may even decide later that you want to change some things or do something in a more controlled environment, but you kind of get that, oh yeah, that's what was possible, that came out, that was some excitement, that worked, that didn't work. But yeah, the biggest challenge people are going to have working alone is just letting those demons of self-criticism come out. And the truth is just going and having fun and doing it. And then really, even if you're kind of feeling like you're getting your butt kicked trying to do something, knock something out, have fun with it, and then come back a day or two later and check it out. Because a lot of times it's amazing where you're just wrestling, you think, oh God, this doesn't work. And we even do this like mixing. We're like, God, I can't get this mix to work. I'm terrible. I'm the dumbest guy in the world. And then you put it away and come back 2 days later and go, oh, that actually totally works. I mixed the bass a little loud. Let me cut that down. But really trying to do whatever you can to get away from that self-critical thing and just try and make expressive art and have fun with it. And then, if you need to come back and look at things in a more controlled way and alter it, you can. But
your brain is the most dangerous piece of outboard gear you own.
Yes, exactly.
I think we all know the trick. Certainly, everybody who's ever worked in a pro situation. But I'm guessing nowadays everybody knows this trick, which is you tell the vocalist, "Run one down for me so I can get a level," and you record it. Yep. Always record it, because that'll be the best performance you're going to get out of them that day. You can always go back.
Unfortunately, it's tougher to fool yourself on that one.
Right, exactly. That's what made me think of that question, because people home alone right now can't have anybody else do that to them. And yep. I think you're right. You know what? The Mick Jagger chicken dance thing, great suggestion. Robin Frederick did it on stage at the Road Rally about 2 or 3 years ago. It was her finest moment at a road rally. Robin Frederick doing Mick Jagger to the song Moves Like Jagger, It was great. Last question. Well, maybe the last question. I've got more, but okay. People, we've talked about mastering before. So many people have so many misconceptions about mastering. They don't really understand why it's done, and we don't need to, let's not go into the history of why it was originally done, for vinyl purposes. But let's say they're going to attempt to learn how to master. They go out and they buy software. There are several on the market that I understand are all very good. How do they learn? How do they teach their ear what to do? Because all mastering engineers who do it on a pro level have great ears. How does somebody at home train their ear so that their ear can guide them into what they need to do when they're mastering?
Yep. That's a really, really good question. And I personally, I do a lot of mastering for folks, but I was a full-time recording engineer for like 20 years before I kind of felt, okay, I think my ears are getting developed enough to do this now.
Yeah.
But I don't mean that to be discouraging. One thing that I would recommend is people kind of avoid getting into, hey, here's a piece of software that does your mastering for you. And I think it's much better to get a couple tools, because to do modern mastering, you're going to need some kind of brick wall limiter. So basically a final limiter that will, control peaks from going up to zero,
right,
that you can push up for level, and you need a clean EQ. And even the one that comes free with Pro Tools is quite good, but something from FabFilter, and there's lots of other companies that make good ones. That is, for a DIY mastering person, that should be 90% of what you're doing. And because, there are some other tools that we use about harmonic, saturation and things like that. But really what you need is that limiter to push up level and that clean EQ to problem solve. And the best way to do this, and to not only get the thing you're working on to sound a little bit better, but to improve your chops, is set your workflow up in a way so it's really easy for you to compare back and forth to records that you think sound great, or records that are successful in the style of music you're trying to pitch, and really just go back and forth and listen to them. And this is counterintuitive at first, but once you develop it, it's going to be super helpful. But when you go and compare to other, successful releases, our natural tendency is to hear the successful thing and then hear the thing we're working on and go, oh, ours doesn't have enough of X, high frequencies, lows, mid, whatever that is. Reality a lot of the times is the mix you're working on actually has too much of something. Mm-hmm. It has too much low end. It has too much high end or mids or whatever that issue is. So what you should do, and again, this takes a lot of effort at the beginning, but then starts to become intuitive, is to go back and compare your mix to something similar and just see, okay, what does mine have too much of? And learn to find where those spots are, and then start pulling those down, starting to reduce those frequencies. And the nice thing is when you start reducing frequencies, all of a sudden you can actually push that limiter a little more aggressively, making your mix sound louder. And just go back and forth between a great reference that you like and try and get close and match that.
What do you think about looking at waveforms when you're A-Bing the stuff?
I would strongly discourage it.
Yeah, I know people that do it, and man, oh man, that's almost like an art unto itself to look at a waveform. Until your ears are trained, it's not going to be valuable to look at the waveform. I guess if you've trained your ears and you're really solid and you spend enough time looking at waveforms, it's kind of like you or I sitting down, on an SSL and knowing where to go, with your eyes shut, kind of.
Yeah, the really difficult thing about that is that, looking at waveforms or looking at frequency analysis tools, all those can do is they can tell you how much energy is in certain ranges. So if you look at yours compared to something you think sounds great, and yours is completely out to lunch, okay, that's something to address. But those analysis tools, they can't tell you how something feels. And I don't mean that in some weird new agey way, but the thing about it is, in a certain frequency range, a female voice will sound different than a male voice. Electric guitar, will feel different than an acoustic guitar. So all these different things, even a singer singing in a different key will feel different in certain frequency ranges. So all those sort of gimmicky tools where, oh yeah, we can analyze some other thing and then smack it onto your thing. Well, unless you've got the same singer, same arrangement, same vocal range, all of those kind of things, it's a little bit of a crapshoot. And for me, the thing about this approach of a good brick wall limiter, a good clean EQ, that should get you 90% there. And again, that last 10%, maybe that last 15%, you might want to use some other tools, and that's when more experience comes into play. But the killer thing about really doing this work and not just trying to use some magic robot to do your mastering online or with some magic plugin is the more you kind of go back and do this comparative subjective analysis, like, oh, how does my track feel compared to the successful one? The more and more you do that, it's amazing the revelations you're going to have, where you're going to go, oh, that's why that mix jumps out of the speakers more than mine, or that's why my mix sounds harsh, or all those kinds of things. And that's going to improve every aspect of what you do. So all of these sort of magic bullet software things or robots online that are supposed to do this, they're crapshoots, but the real downside to them is they don't make you a better engineer. They don't make you a better producer. They don't make you a better musician. And if you use basic tools and really learn that, everything gets better. So when you have success on one project, it's going to improve how you do the next project versus sending something to some magic software that's supposed to master. That's not going to help you at all. It's just going to be a crapshoot that may or may not come out good.
And the follow-up to that, we've only got 4 minutes left on the show, but the follow-up is, what do you use? What's your preferred metering?
I use kind of several, and this is going to sound really goofy, but there's a Slate FGX, and I'm giving you an honest answer, not the answer I should be giving you publicly. But okay. Slate FGX has a meter on it. I almost never use it for its process. It's kind of a limiter compressor thing. I hardly ever use it anymore for that, but the meter on it is big, and I know it really well. And so I can see things on that meter and kind of have a good idea of what that's going to translate. But I run 4 different SPL Hawkeye, I run BX Limiter, and also the meter plugs thing. So I actually run kind of multiple meters to check in different ways, but the one that I honestly rely on most when I'm kind of working fast is this Slate one, which is funky and kind of inaccurate and things like that, but it's the one I actually know well. But the good news about that is whatever you use for metering, really spend time kind of metering what's going on with your master compared to successful releases that you're using as references. So, they call the ballistics of the metering and stuff. Those all can be different, and even how they're calibrated can be different. But if you're looking at successful references as a target and then comparing it to what you're doing, that's actually, as long as you know the meter well, it can, you'll end up in a pretty good place.
Up against a hard break, as they say in the business, but can you give us about a minute and a half on the recording boot camp? What people can expect to learn there, when it is, how they can find out more, all that good stuff.
Wonderful. Well, go to recordingbootcamp.com, also even RonanChrisMurphy.com to connect you with the stuff I do. And in this crazy world, we're figuring things out. But I do a lot of consulting. And the funny thing actually was everybody recording at home.
Yeah.
I'm actually doing a lot more consulting around the world now because people are sitting at home trying to work on projects. So I'm getting calls about dealing with that.
I bet you won't be going to Italy this year.
Yeah, I actually have 2.5 months of trips booked to Italy this year. So we actually have canceled a 6-day boot camp over there at least postponed it. And in May, we were supposed to do a recording retreat and a songwriting retreat in West Virginia, and those have been postponed back till August and September, and we're really hoping that those ones in West Virginia, the recording boot camp, the 6-day thing, that's just me. And it's a very kind of set curriculum. And the retreats in West Virginia, beautiful mountain resort, and that's we have a whole big team of different mentors that work and teach, and that changes every year. But we've pushed those back to August and September, and we're hoping we actually get to do them.
All right. Well, we're up against 5 o'clock. Always a pleasure to talk with you.
I miss can't wait to do it in person again.
Yeah, I miss not seeing you in person. And I love hanging out with you. One of these days, we should put together a night where it's like you, me, Shirelli, Ken Calais, all the old dog engineers, and just go out for a pizza and talk about this stuff. I love it.
I'm absolutely in.
And so the website, once again, is recordingbootcamp.com, and Ronan, RONAN, RonanChrisMurphy.com. You can see his mugshots, all that good stuff on there. And a pleasure, sir. I will talk to you soon.
Awesome, and stay safe, everybody. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. You stay safe, stay healthy, and talk to you soon, Ronan. Thanks, man.
All right. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye-bye. Well, there you have it, folks. He's so much fun to hang out with. I hope it's not just me that enjoys that. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. I'm pretty sure I can get him to go into the comments underneath the video. So let's see. Do I have an engineering book to? You know what? If you want to go leave a question for Ronan in the comments, we will pick the best question, and I will get Fett to send you a copy of his mixing book, which is excellent. He doesn't know it yet, but I can make him do that. So that's it for today. See you guys tomorrow, which will be Thursday. Having a hard time keeping track of the days. Tomorrow, 4 o'clock, right here. Same time, same place. Have a good night. And where's the band? Don't forget to give us a like, subscribe if you've never, and hit that little bell up in the corner. All right? See you guys next time for another exciting episode of Taxi TV Live. Bye-bye.